What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook and welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. I'm pretty excited about this week's project. I've got a live edge, what I'm calling a reverse river table, since the slab runs down the center and the slab is surrounded by this gorgeous black epoxy resin. So hopefully you guys enjoy this one. I'm really happy with the way this thing came out. And I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the video.
Before casting this slab in epoxy, I needed to get it at least relatively flat. And since this slab was wider than my joiner bed, I could only flatten a portion of the slab, and I needed to remove the guard on the jointer in order to do this. So if you're going to try this technique, make sure you are extremely careful, as that spinning head will mess you up in an instant if you're not paying attention. So after removing the guard, I could start getting one part of the slab flattened, which required multiple passes. And this slab had a pretty good twist to it, and I was able to remove most of it during this milling process without making the slab too thin. As you can see here, jointing part of the face of a slab leaves you with a ridge between the flattened and unflattened areas. And the flattened area was now my reference surface when I moved over to the planer. To keep that unflattened area from interfering, I added a strip of MDF to the planer bed to raise the slab off of the bed of the planer so that only the flattened area was contacting the MDF. And one thing I didn't notice when I was actually doing the milling, but that I've noticed now that I look back at this footage, is that the slab was being lifted slightly by that high side, which was essentially following the twist. And to help resist this, I needed to put some pressure on the left side of the slab as it was going through the planer, which I obviously didn't do. Anyway, after flattening the opposite face of the slab, I could flip it over with that newly flattened face towards the planer bed and get rid of the ridge left by the jointer. And now if you don't have a jointer or planer, you could just use a router sled here and get pretty much the same result. Once the ridge was gone, I flipped the slab a few times to take an even amount of material off of each face, and then I could let the slab relax in my shop for a bit before I cast it in epoxy. The next day, I needed to trim the slab to length, which I did with my track saw. And I actually wanted this slab to run down the center of the table diagonally, and this was because of the angle this crotch was cut at. And I wanted to remove as little from this section as possible because everyone knows crotch figure is the best, and that meant cutting the end of the slab at a slight angle. After making the cut, I could mark out where I needed to make my cut on the other end of the slab, and to make sure this cut was at least relatively parallel to the first cut, I set my 12-inch speed square against the cut edge and made sure my tape measure was in line with the square. I made a few marks referencing some different areas, and then I could cut the other end to length. Before moving on, I decided to try a new tool that I just received in the mail, the Orion 950 moisture meter from Wagner Meters, who is the sponsor of this week's video. And I'll talk more about this meter later in the video, but I wanted to confirm that this slab was indeed ready to use, as it was air dried and close to 2 inches thick originally. And making sure the moisture content of the slab was at a good level was especially important on this project, as epoxy is a lot less forgiving when it comes to wood movement and just moisture in general. Next, I could get the form built, and I actually used the same form I had used previously on my river headboard, and I'll link to that video in case you missed it. And since this MDF was already taped up with the Tyvek tape, all I had to do was cut it to size and assemble it, which made things a lot easier. I used a combination of my table saw, track saw, and miter saw for this, and then I could get the form assembled. So before assembling, I did need to add more Tyvek tape in a few spots where I had some screw holes from the previous project so that the epoxy wouldn't leak out of those holes. And the Total Boat deep cast epoxy I used on this project has an extremely low viscosity, so this form needed to be absolutely watertight to avoid any leaks. To assemble the form, I used some 1 1/4 screws and made sure to pre-drill and countersink the holes, as MDF is extremely prone to splitting otherwise. I added screws roughly every 8 inches along the underside of the form, and then added 1 screw in each corner to hold the sides together. Next, I caulked all the seams with 100% silicone caulk and used a fondant tool to get a really clean corner. And this is a trick I picked up from my buddy Mike from Industrial Maker, and it works amazingly well. Once it sets up, the excess silicone just peels right off, and since the ball tool leaves a gap between the excess and the silicone in the seam, it leaves a perfectly clean caulk line. Since the slab was cut at a diagonal, I needed to remove 1 corner on each end of the slab to get it to fit in the form. So to do this, I first marked a line where the slab intersected with the form, and then marked a square line on the face of the slab. I trimmed off those areas with the track saw, and then I could get the slab secured in the form. To do this, I just used hot glue, which is plenty strong enough to hold the slab down during casting, but is easily removed afterwards. I added plenty of hot glue, pressed the slab into the form, and then sprayed out any sawdust with some compressed air. And with that, the slab was ready for casting in epoxy, and again, for this project, I used a new to me epoxy, this thick-set casting resin from Total Boat. On a pour this large, Total Boat recommends pouring to a maximum depth of about 1 inch at a time, otherwise the epoxy will go exothermic and cure too quickly, and since I had to do the pour in 2 layers, I wanted to make sure the layers were as identical as possible, so I weighed out the pigment to keep things nice and even. Also, this Rockler silicone mat is my new favorite thing when mixing things like epoxy and pouring finishes. Since basically nothing sticks to silicone, it's really easy to clean up and saves my workbench from getting covered in epoxy. Total Boat recommends mixing the epoxy in 1 gallon or less increments, again because of heat buildup, and I had these half-gallon mixing containers on hand, so that's what I went with. And while mixing in these smaller quantities did make things go slightly slower, it also allowed me to easily gauge how much epoxy I needed as I went, rather than trying to mix one huge, expensive batch in one shot. So on the first pour, I used a total of 1.5 gallons, mixing 3 batches, and also these slow-mo epoxy pouring shots are so satisfying. So after pouring that first round, I let the epoxy set up overnight, and then I could pour the rest of the epoxy, another 2 gallons in this case. And before pouring the second set of pours, I scuffed up the surface of the first pour with some high grit sandpaper so that the epoxy layers would adhere to each other better. And I was able to fill the form all the way up to the brim with the last pour. And after that, I let the epoxy cure for about another 24 hours. While the epoxy was curing, I went ahead and got to work on the table base, which I made out of the hard maple left over from the butcher block counters I built a few weeks ago. I kept the design of the base super simple just to allow the top to really be the main focal point, and the legs are these kind of rectangular assemblies that are connected with these 2 long stretchers, and the stretchers are about 1/2 inch taller than the legs, which lifts the tabletop off of the legs and gives the top a nice floating look. I cut the parts to rough size at the miter saw and table saw, and then squared up the pieces at the jointer and planer. Finally, I cut the pieces to final length at the miter saw, and then I could get to cutting the joinery. So I decided to go kind of the easy route on this project and use my domino, which I actually haven't used in quite some time. Actually, after thinking about it, I realized this was, I think, the first piece of actual furniture I've built in the new shop, which is pretty cool. And as always, if you don't have a domino, there are tons of ways to assemble a base like this, including pocket holes or dowel joinery or traditional mortise and tenons. I think I need to get a t-shirt made with that line on it just to wear while I'm using the domino. To give the domino better support on these small pieces, I used the trim stop attachment, which just makes things a lot more stable. And this is especially true on the longer parts of the legs since I had to have the domino oriented vertically. I also added 2 dominoes at each joint, both for strength and for alignment. And to do this, I cut all of the mortises with the original height setting and then checked the fit, and then I lowered the height setting and went back around to cut the second mortise at each joint. And the rule of thumb here is to have a thickness at least equal to the domino you're using on either side of the mortises, which you can see I have here. I cut the rest of the mortises, and then I could move on to gluing up the leg assemblies. And this went smoothly, although I did mix up 2 of the pieces during assembly, which resulted in just a little bit of misalignment, and I was able to sand that away at the drum sander after the glue dried, so that was not a big deal. Next, I could cut the mortises that connected the long stretchers and the leg assemblies, and I used a single 10mm domino in each joint here, which was plenty strong for this kind of light use haul table. I also made sure to factor in that 1/2 inch overhang on the stretchers so that I would be able to maintain that overhang after assembly. To cut the mortises on the leg assemblies, I had to use the domino in its vertical orientation again, but I just made sure to line it up with my layout lines, and the mortises ended up in the right spots. So with the mortises cut, I could dry fit the base, and it was looking really good. Before assembling the base, I needed to finish up a few things, first of which was drilling the recessed through holes for the bolts I would use to attach the base to the top. I marked out the hole locations and drilled them over the drill press, and I used a Forstner bit to drill a recessed hole and then an oversized bit to drill the through hole to allow room for wood movement. Next, I needed to cut the corners off of the raised ends of the long stretchers so that they'd blend in nicely with the leg assemblies. So I just kept it simple and cut the corners at a 60-degree angle at the miter saw. And with that, I could move on to finish prep, first sanding all of the parts up to 120 grit. And I wanted to add a chamfer to the edges of the base, and I decided to try this new chamfer bit from Infinity Tools. And instead of a bearing, it has a brass tip that allows the bit to follow tighter contours, especially inside corners like this. And this means you end up with a much more consistent chamfer, and it reduces the need for any extra hand tool work. I also made sure to mark out where to stop and start the chamfers where the stretchers join the leg assemblies, as otherwise I would have been left with gaps there. While I'm working, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Wagner Meters, and the meter I used in this video, the Orion 950. So the Orion 950 is Wagner's top-of-the-line pinless moisture meter in their Orion line, and it has some really cool features unique to Wagner moisture meters. One of these is the EMC, or Equilibrium Moisture Content Calculation, which will tell you the moisture level your particular piece of wood will get to in a given environment, rather than having to just guess based on a standardized number. Also, the Orion line of moisture meters come with calibration blocks, so you can recalibrate your meter back to factory specs in the field if you suspect it might have gotten out of calibration. Last, Wagner's meters are backed by a 7-year warranty and are built to last a lifetime. So to learn more about the Orion 950 and all of Wagner's moisture meters, click the link in the video description below, and thanks to Wagner Meters for sponsoring this week's project. Once I had chamfered all the pieces, I could move on to assembling the base, which went really smoothly. I added glue and dominoes and then clamped the pieces together, which required me to pull out my longest clamps. And I checked everything for square and then left the base to dry overnight. Before applying finish, I sanded the base up to 180 grit, breaking all the edges and smoothing out the chamfers. I also chamfered the corners of the leg assemblies with my block plane, since these would have been pretty tricky on the router table. Last, I blended the joint between the stretcher and leg assemblies with my sander so that there was a nice smooth transition between those pieces. For the finish, I went with the black poly I've been using so much lately, and I think it was really fitting for this project. Again, I really wanted the top to be the focal point here, so having the base kind of blend in with the top really worked out nicely. Also, by spraying the base black, it gives the wood just more of a neutral look, and it could just as easily be steel. So I sprayed on 3 coats in total, and then I could get back to working on the top. So this is how the top looked after the epoxy cured, and you might notice that the epoxy looks a little bit weird and there's some gaps around the edges. And that's because the epoxy did seem to go slightly exothermic during the curing process, which meant it cured much faster than intended. And if I had been going for a more clear epoxy look, this would have probably caused some cloudiness, but didn't really matter in this case with the black epoxy. This did introduce some more bubbles into the final piece though, which I did have to deal with a little bit later on. So removing the form was pretty simple. I first removed all the screws and then knocked off the sides with a dead blow mallet. Next, I used a 5-in-1 tool to lift the epoxy from the form, and eventually I was able to pull the tabletop off of the bottom of the form. And as you can see, the epoxy actually filled in pretty much the entire underside of the tabletop, which actually worked out as it gave the top a little bit of extra thickness. After removing the silicone, it was time for the moment of truth, sending the top through the planer to reveal the final look of the top. Now, luckily I have a 20-inch planer, but if you don't and want to make a table like this, you could either use something like a router sled to flatten your top, or just find a local cabinet shop who'd be willing to send your top through their wide belt sander, which is what I did for my river headboard. And it's surprisingly cheap. It was like $75 to do that on my headboard, and it'll save you a ton of time sanding. Anyway, my planer was big enough for this piece, so I just made multiple shallow passes until I had an even surface, and I really liked the way it was looking. So after planing, I ran it through the drum sander a little bit, but realized there were a few small sections that weren't quite fully cured. They were just a little bit gummy, so I needed to let the epoxy rest overnight again, but I couldn't help but throw on some mineral spirits just to see how the finished piece was gonna look, and it got me pretty excited. So since I needed to wait for the casting epoxy to fully cure anyway, I went ahead and filled those little pinholes in the top with more epoxy, using Total Boat's high performance epoxy this time, since it cures much faster. And I just mixed it according to the instructions, added some more of the black metallic pigment, and then filled all the pinholes and any other imperfections in the slab that were exposed after planing. So I let the epoxy cure overnight, and the next day I could get the slab cleaned up, as all of the epoxy had fully cured at that point. To remove the bulk of the excess high performance epoxy, I pulled out my low angle jack plane and planed diagonally across the tabletop. And I really prefer planing excess epoxy to sanding it, since epoxy dust really gums up sandpaper and creates this terrible fine dust. Also, hand planing just keeps your guns looking really good even when you haven't made it to the gym in a few years. Anyway, after planing, I passed the top through my drum sander to get all of the excess epoxy off, and then I could cut the slab to final size. I used a combination of my track saw and table saw for this, first cutting one straight reference edge with the track saw. And I found that saws tend to leave a better surface finish than a planer or jointer with epoxy, so that's why I used the track saw here rather than the jointer. With one clean edge, I cut the tabletop to final width of the table saw, cleaning up the other edge. I also wanted to add a bevel to the underside of the tabletop, which would accomplish a few things. First, it would give the top a lighter visual weight, which I think worked really well with the table base. Also, it would hide the layer line between the two pores more effectively, and this layer line was barely noticeable, but the bevel made it essentially invisible in the finished piece. I cut the bevel at a 30-degree angle, and I think this ended up looking really nice. I also left about a 1/4 inch wide flat area on each edge, which just kept the edges from being too sharp in the finished piece. Next, I repeated the same process on the ends of the top, this time using my track saw, and I snuck up on the bevel with the track saw, moving the track over in small increments until the bevels met up perfectly. With that, the tabletop was to its final size, so now it was time for the worst part of any epoxy project, sanding. So since epoxy is essentially plastic, it shows scratches extremely easily, so you need to sand it to a much higher grit than you would on a typical wooden project. Luckily, the black epoxy required less of this, but it was still a lot of sanding. I sanded the top up to 180 grit and then wiped it down with mineral spirits to check my progress, and unfortunately those little pinholes were still visible, probably just due to the amount of material I had removed during sanding. And I didn't want to do another entire epoxy pour, as one, it would have taken a long time, but I also just don't think it would have solved the issue. So instead I turned to CA glue, and I filled the pinholes with some thin CA glue, which actually worked really well, and then wiped off the excess with a paper towel, which was evidently a bad idea. And you can just see the paper towel in the lower left-hand corner of this shot, and it actually started to smoke and release some horrible fumes. So I ran it outside and spread it out on the ground, and I think it was basically having an exothermic reaction similar to the epoxy, since it was just too concentrated in one area without enough airflow. Anyway, after letting the CA glue dry, I continued sanding up to 320 grit, making sure the bevel and the edges of the tabletop were nice and smooth as well. I also chamfered the edges of the table with my block plane before finishing up sanding with 320 grit. Once I was done sanding, I vacuumed the surface, blew off the dust with compressed air, and finally wiped down the surface with mineral spirits, all to try and remove all of that dust. And as I mentioned, epoxy dust is the worst, and since friction and plastic tends to create static, the dust really wants to hold on for dear life. For the finish on this project, I used Rubio Monocoat, which I've had a lot of luck with on epoxy projects in the past. I mixed the pure oil and 2C accelerator thoroughly, and then applied the finish with a plastic applicator. And a little goes a long way with Rubio, and I mixed way more than I needed, unfortunately, since this stuff is not cheap. Once the bottom was finished, I could finally get the finish added to the top, which was really the moment I was looking forward to this whole project, and it did not disappoint. The walnut really came to life, and the black epoxy has this subtle pattern from the mica and the black pigment that just looks beautiful. After letting the finish sit for a few minutes and react with the wood, I wiped off the excess and could just stand back and admire the top. So I let the monocoat set up over the weekend, and then I could get the base attached to the top. And I used tapped holes for this, which I've had a lot of success with in the past, and they're really easy to create. First, I centered the base on the bottom of the top and marked the hole locations using a brad point bit, since my cinder punch was too short to reach through the stretchers evidently. Next, I drilled the holes using the corresponding drill bit for the 1/4-20 tap I used, and I made sure to mark my depth, as the last thing I wanted to do was accidentally drill through my top here. After drilling the holes, I blew out any dust with compressed air and then tapped the holes with the tap. And these taps were originally the Wood Whisperer thread taps, which I guess now are available at Eagle America. And I've used this tap dozens of times and have never had any issues. It creates a super strong connection, And the benefit over using a normal wood screw is you can thread the bolt in and out numerous times without weakening the threads. Anyway, with the top attached to the base, I could call this project finished.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Working with epoxy always comes with its struggles, but I really love the way this thing came together. If you guys want to see more about the tools and materials I used on this project, I'll have links to those down in the video description below. Also, if it's your first time to the channel, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that little notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. And last, I want to say a big thanks to all of my YouTube members for their support. If you guys are interested in checking that out, I'll link to that somewhere on the screen as well. All right, thanks for watching, everybody, and until next week, happy building.